The Perfect Dictatorship, China in the 21st Century, by Stein Ringen, Hong Kong University Press. Page 19, Economic Growth. There is no question that the Chinese economy has grown rapidly in the period, but that has been in the early and easy takeoff. In an economy that restarts from destruction, there will be growth unless it is prevented by new destructions. This has been all the more so for the Chinese economy, which so far has had the winds of supporting demographics in its back with a pool of cheap labor to draw on. But we do not know how strongly the economy has grown or to what size. The official statistics are not reliable, partly because local authorities falsify the statistics to their advantage. The official GDP of the provinces adds up to about 10% more than the GDP of the nation. The statistics from different government agencies and provinces are not in accordance with each other. There are two official sets of national GDP numbers, which differ somewhat, one measured by the production method and one by the expenditure method. China may have grown to the world's second biggest economy, but even if the official statistics were true, that still amounts to only about 10% of global GDP for 20% of global population. In per capita terms, China's national income is at least a sixth of that of the United States. The economy is supposedly overtaken. Mega growth is now over and is starting to be seen, correctly, as a relatively short period of recovery. Growth is showing and will continue to slow. Growth is slowing and will continue to slow. The population is no longer growing other than by increasing longevity. The national birth rate is 1.6 or 1.7 children per woman in cities below 1 and in large cities down to 0.7 or less. In the next 15 years, the share of the population that is 60 or older will increase from 14 to 25%. Just as the economy needs to make itself human capital dependent, the pool of human capital is starting to shrink. Measuring China's economy is obviously not easy, and there are many reasons, not necessarily conspiratorial, why the statistics might be wobbly. Although official data on the economy's size and growth are often accepted, for example, by international agencies, and reproduced uncritically in the international press and by admirers of the Chinese model, economists are aware that they are no more than suggestive. Attempts to correct the official numbers have produced diverse results. An international consultancy, the Rhodium Group, in a report published in 2015, have suggested an upwards adjustment of the official 2013 GDP numbers to the effect that the economy would be 13 to 16% bigger than officially measured. This is a methodological numbers exercise of applying revised principles in the system of national accounts to the Chinese case, apparently in a more friendly application than that adopted by the state statisticians. It assumes that the economy, as officially measured, is one of sound production and consumption, and that the problem is how to value its different components. The biggest contribution to the upward statement is a higher estimate for imputed rent, what homeowners pay themselves, followed by higher estimates for industry, construction, and service activity, and for the value of research and development. This notches the growth figures upwards, not because anything new is happening in the economy, but because what is happening is accounted differently. The exercise has little or no influence on the estimates of growth. When the National Bureau of Statistics issued its own revisions in December 2014, it similarly adjusted one of its two figures upwards by about 3%. It's the effect of bringing its two GDP figures into closer harmony with each other. Adjustments of this kind say more about national accounting than about real economics. Most observers probably suspect that the official statistics overstates rather than understates the strength of the economy. The more critical correction is to adjust the official numbers downwards. No one knows what China's GDP was after Mao's adventurism. It was damaged, but possibly not as much as has been thought. If subsequent statistics started from too low a base, growth will have been overstated, at least initially. Nor is there certainty about the rate of inflation. If national accounts do not adjust enough for inflation, growth will again be overstated. Nor is the huge volume of debt known or again whether national accounts adjust adequately. For example, if, as has been widespread, new housing estates are built and never used, that pushes up the GDP numbers but represents no real economic value. All the more if they are funded from debts that the projects cannot service. Nor are the underlying data robust. The National Bureau of Statistics does not have sector-by-sector prices, and for some purposes has to use more or less rough proxy estimates. These central statisticians work from provincial and local data that have to be aligned for consistency. The pressure for good GDP statistics has been obvious, in particular locally, and it would be superhuman to expect there to be no tendency to adjust favorably. Even tiny biases upwards in individual adjustments can add up to very noticeable overstatements in the final measures. An important reason why measured growth has been unrealistically high is that some of the growth has been driven by heavy debt-financed investments with a higher level of debt than the investments can reward. The government has stimulated economic activity by pouring in cheap credit and by directing its own enterprises to turn that credit into a stream of investment, some of it sound and some of it bad. The GDP statistics record all of the economic activity, but do not adjust realistically for the burden of debt and for bad investments. Simply, the system of national accounts is not geared to dealing realistically with the economy that relies on excessive debt investment in the way that the Chinese one has. A recent study for another international consultancy, the Conference Board, finds actual annual growth in years with official rates of about 10% to have been typically about 7 to 7.5%. Taking the best growth periods for China and other East Asian countries, the study finds China's growth to fall slightly short of that of South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. By 2012, it estimates China's real growth rate to have been 4.1%, as compared to the official rate of 7.7%. Two other consultancies, Capital Economics and Lombard Street, estimate a sharper downward slide in the pace of growth than the trend in the official statistics shows, bringing GDP growth by 2014 to 15 down to 4.3 and 3.7% respectively, as compared to the official estimates of 7%. Estimates by researchers at the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission suggest that almost half of the total investment in the Chinese economy in the years 2009 to 2013, the period of post-2008 recession stimulus, was ineffective. Their research also found that investment efficiency has fallen sharply in recent years, which means that the economy gets steadily less additional economic growth for every unit of additional investment, to the effect that annual growth in the relevant period corrected for ineffective investment would be 2 to 3 percentage points lower than in the official statistics. These quantifications are questionable, but economists agree that there is much inefficient investment in the Chinese economy, and that efficiency has declined. It is not unexpected in a growing economy that investment efficiency declines, but decline in China is more than expected and resulting from a great deal of wasted investment. The accumulated effect of these downgradings is that the economy is probably about a third smaller than it is made out to be officially. Rather than up there with the United States, it is a second-tier economy, more like Japan or Germany, and in per capita terms, only a middle-income one. While growth is slowing in China, it is picking up in its Asian competitor, India. In the International Monetary Fund's IMF predictions, India will overtake China in the pace of economic growth by 2016. Another effect is that economic inequality, although grotesque even by official statistics, has probably been underestimated, since the share of wealth held by the very rich has been estimated relative to an inflated total. These exercises are of a different kind from that of the Rhodium Group. Here it is not only the valuation of the various economic components that is reassessed, but also the substance of some of those components, which is to say not just how the system of national accounts is applied, but also what it is applied to. If you dig holes in the ground and fill them up again, that is economic activity without anything being produced. If you borrow money to build highways that are never used, or apartments that are never lived in, that is investment, but not investment in that creates real capital that is converted again into real consumption for further production. It works like this. If an unnecessary airport is built, that is economic activity. It creates demand for steel, concrete, glass, and the like, and the jobs are generated. This shows up as GDP in the statistics. But once the airport is there with little traffic, it becomes a drain on the economy. It has to be kept up and maintained and kept in service for little or no business. During the growth period, China has had a steady flow of such ineffective investments that has notched up the GDP numbers to artificial levels. The numbers have not always been incorrect, but nor have they realistically reflected real economic strength. Part of the reason why measured economic growth has recently been falling is that the burden of ineffective investment has been accumulating and, so to speak, caught up with the real economy and come to weigh more heavily in the balance. The new figures are lower, partly because real growth is down, but partly also because the previous exaggerated figures are no longer statistically maintained. False economies are not exclusive to China, but one of the ways in which the Chinese state's investment-driven economy is different is that it has more and bigger false economies than usual. The more realistic way of reassessing the economy is to ask what real strength it has rather than just how the numbers add up. The way of approaching it unavoidably leads to a downward adjustment. It is difficult to get away from the obsession with GDP size, although in the end it is not a very meaningful issue. If you string a border around 1.4 billion people, you have a big economy no matter what the circumstances. The US economy is not strong because it is 200 million people big, but because it generates a higher per capita income for 300 million people. As so often, China gets overestimated because of its bigness. Corruption. In China's control-obsessive bureaucratic state, cheating and dishonesty is endemic. Officials and services cheat on their clients. Colleagues cheat on each other. Lower-level agencies cheat on their duties and misuse allocated funds. Local governments falsify data that go into official statistics. Police officers, judges, doctors, school teachers, and administrators are massively dishonest in the exercise of service. Of course, not everyone and not every service is dishonest, but cheating is rampant. And then there is corruption. Corruption is a problem for many governments. In the Chinese case, it goes to the heart of the state and is on a monumental scale. It is a problem with vast consequences. When the state itself is corrupt, it is impossible to maintain a culture of honesty in business or a culture of service in public administration. Xi Jinping has launched a hard campaign against corruption, to which we will return later. Before that, we need to try to get a grip on the nature and scale of the problem. Corruption is criminal activity and is by the nature of things as much as possible hidden from public view. Although there has until recently been restraints in the flaunting of obviously corrupt wealth, we know that there is corruption of massive proportions, but we do not know with precision how much or exactly how it works. No honest student of the Chinese system would be able to say that he or she really knows what it is about. And any efforts to describe it is unavoidably, to some degree, speculative. There are different kinds of corruption, and we need to pick it apart. Starting at the bottom of the system, there is low-level corruption in the form of workday officials taking payments from clients for services, permission, stamps of approval, and certificates, in everything from business permits via schooling, medical treatment, social assistance, and policing to birth certificates. All can be granted, delayed, or denied, and all can elicit payment. Again, not every official is corrupt. A colleague who knows China well has reminded me that there are still officials who live in 6th-floor walk-ups, ride their bikes to the office, and don't have kids living it up in the West. But we know from surveys, for example, by the Pew Research Center, that corruption on this level is a fact of life to a greater or lesser degree for most citizens, and something that intrudes into their lives in a way they resent strongly. Further up is within bureaucracy corruption. in the form of selling and buying of posts and promotions. In a state that boasts practicing meritocratic recruitment, posts and positions are often sold to the highest bidder. This is true in the party, in the state bureaucracy, and in the armed forces. It also includes the buying of memberships in the People's Congresses, the People's Political Consultative Conferences, and other official committees on both central and local levels. It involves kickbacks upwards in the system for the allocation of funds downwards to local agencies. A former party secretary of the Hunan Poverty Alleviation Authority went on trial for having accepted more than 11 million yuan in bribes between 1992 and 2013 in exchange for funds for anti-poverty programs. No one knows exactly how widespread these practices are, but the buying and selling of promotions is sufficiently prevalent in the armed forces, for example, that most observers consider it to be a factor in giving these forces less capacity than their size would suggest. Two former vice-chairmen of the Central Military Commission, who both served until 2012, have been put under prosecution for corruption. The first one, General Su Chao-hao, was charged in June 2014 and confessed to taking huge bribes, some through family members, in return for appointments and promotions. He died in March 2015 before he could be put on trial. The second one, General Guo Boshang, was arrested on 10 April 2015. A former PLA deputy logistics chief, Gu Zhenshan, has been charged with accepting bribes to promote hundreds of officers, taking in tens of millions of yuan. A recent report that somehow got distributed by Xinhua, the official news agency, gave a rare insight into this surreal world of corruption. This was clearly a mistake, and the report was quickly removed from the Xinhua and other sites in China, but not before it was picked up outside of the country. The main sellers are senior officials, particularly the top official in the region, or a unit who has power over personnel matters. The number two, and sometimes the third and even fourth in command, take bribes to help people get promoted. Some borrowed from banks, while others sought sponsorship from businessmen who would reap the benefits after the official was promoted. Some used money obtained through bribes or other corruption. Buyers could also pay through installments, just like a homeowner might pay their mortgage. Recent cases have indicated the size of payments involved. Lu Yingguang, former party chief of Maoming City in Guangdong, was sentenced to death last year for receiving more than 100 million yuan in bribes from 64 officials seeking promotions. Liu set posts with specific price tags: 200,000 yuan for technology posting, 2 million yuan for department level 1, 10 million yuan for deputy mayor position. On top of this again is high-level embezzlement from the state. Here the term corruption is not adequate. It is too kind. This is organized crime and is probably the practice which is the murkiest and on which there is the least publicly available hard evidence. It is also new, not good old-fashioned bribery related to the Chinese tradition of gift giving, but a practice born out of the recent investment boom. What is often admired as the restructuring of the sector of state-owned enterprises over the last 20 years or so has consisted in part in the shutting down of poorly performing entitlement entities, which were sometimes merged with better performing ones or otherwise sold, given away, or abandoned. This created a bonus for entrepreneurial operators to take over faltering firms at bargain prices or at no price at all, be it for continued activity on new terms or asset stripping. China's brand of economic growth created a further bonus in the form of contract trading and land leasing. This bonus was fueled on by the post-2008 stimulus injection of cash and easy credit into the state sector. Every infrastructural investment project, large or small, is a potential vehicle for the robbery of state funds. Someone has to dig out the coal and minerals. Someone has to run the cement factories, smelters, and steelworks. Someone has to construct the dams, energy plants, and electricity grids. Someone has to build the highways, railways, airports, and skyscrapers. And someone the new schools, hospitals, and universities, and further on the new museums, cinemas, city parks, and playgrounds. And someone has had to make the land available for these investments. These operators and someones, and their subsidiaries, partners, and subcontractors may be private businesses or state or local government enterprises. All this restructuring and investment booming has been and is state-driven. It is the state that has shut down enterprises and that's decided what is to be done with them. It is the state that grants mining and development contracts. It is the state that grants business permits. It is the state that allocates land, which is to say that there are officials, high and low, who are in charge of it all. Those officials may be selling contracts, permits, or land leases, or they may themselves be participating entrepreneurs in disguise who are giving themselves or family members or friends or connections contracts or permits or land. The contracts that are successful will not be the best ones, but the ones that pay the best, which is to say the ones that has embezzled the state. The delivery on contracts will tend to be substandard, enabling further embezzlement as works go on, since the oversight is in the hands of officials who are already involved or on the take. Officials on all levels, up to the very top, down to the local level, and into the fringes of the vast public sector, such as, for example, Beijing Zoo, where procurement graft in part explains the deplorable conditions animals are held in, make themselves rich, and family and friends are able to use connections to enrich themselves. This kind of corruption has been not only widespread, but by all accounts also monumental, really beyond what is comprehensible to the normal mind. Cases of millions, hundreds of millions, billions being looted from the public purse. In December 2014, Zhou Yongkang, until 2012 a member of the Standing Committee of the Party Politburo and head of domestic security, was expelled from the party and arrested on charges of taking bribes and helping family members and connections to plunder the state. He was formally charged in April 2015 and sentenced in June in a secret trial to life in prison, the deprivation of all political rights and the confiscation of all property. He was found guilty of bribery, abuse of power, and the leaking of state secrets. The life sentence was on the bribery charge. Also in late 2014, investigators discovered more than 200 million yuan in cash stored away in several flats owned by a stash of notes, owned by a former coal official Wei Pingyuan. The South China Morning Post estimated that the stash of notes would weigh more than 2.3 tons, since the highest Chinese denomination is the 100 yuan note. This was not even the case of a top official. He had only been a deputy director of the National Development and Reform Commission's Coal Department. A colleague of his up the line, former deputy director of the commission, Liu Tainan, was sentenced to life in prison and the confiscation of all personal property on 10 December 2014 for having accepted bribes of 35 million yuan from 2002 to 2012, some through a son. In August 2015, Gu Zhenshan, mentioned above, was sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve for embezzlement, accepting bribes and bribery, misuse of state funds, and abuse of power. The reprieve meant that the death sentence was unlikely to be carried out, and he was for good measure deprived of all political rights, stripped of his rank as lieutenant general, and had all personal assets confiscated. In a different case, one operator was reported to have paid one of his backers a bribe in the form of a Mercedes-Benz with 100 kilograms of gold in the boot. China Economic Weekly, 24 November 2014, reports and estimates that public officials took 1 trillion yuan in stolen money overseas in the years 2000 to 2011. In consultancy, the Emergency Advisors Group has estimated that the equivalent of $1 trillion was embezzled during the post-2008 stimulus, which might amount to as much as 5% of GDP annually, and a Washington-based advocacy group, Global Financial Integrity, estimated that the mainland lost $1.25 trillion between 2003 and 2012 to illicit outflows, including tax evasion, crime, and corruption. A report in early 2015 by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists on the offshore holdings of China's elite suggests that between $1 and 4 trillion in untraced assets have left the country since 2000. Figures like this, although necessarily speculative, are not flights of fancy and give a good indication of the scale. The driving force in this conglomerate of theft is the high-level organized crime. That is where the big action is. That is what makes public posts valuable enough down the line to be bought and sold for big money, and makes it worth buying the protection of a membership of a People's Congress. And it is the criminality up the line that creates the culture of low-level corruption. When workday officials see that those higher up enrich themselves, they will feel entitled to do likewise. At this level, the effect is to inflate the corruption value of public services. Where previously the expected gift was a watch, now it is a car. The Chinese are accustomed to paying for services with gifts, but gift expectations have notched up to painful and demoralizing levels. Corruption on this scale and in this breadth has manifold consequences. Income is redistributed from ordinary citizens to boosting the wealth of the rich. The estate is robbed of funds and deprived of capacity, leaking efficiency through corruption. Too many officials are too concerned with their own maneuvering and entrepreneurship and distracted from their job duties. Too many officers not only have little military competence, but are also preoccupied with entrepreneurship at the expense of military planning and work. But the consequences go further and deeper. At the top of the pyramid of corruption has emerged an oligarchic class of high officials and business operators which is parasitic on the state and not in its service or under its control. For the party states, that is not just an economic problem, but also a power problem. All governments want their officials to be beholden to them for their pay, which is how they secure their loyalty. The oligarchic officials, however, are not beholden to their formal employer. Their employment is their base for entrepreneurship, which is from where they have their real income. The state is dependent on contractors and operators for the execution of development projects, but cannot control the works they deliver or the price they charge, since the operators have co-opted their controllers into criminality, or the controllers have turned operators. The control-obsessed party states that is supposed to have a monopoly of controlling power is dependent on an oligarchic class which operates a competing source of power. Around the country, there are economic fiefdoms that are laws unto themselves and states within the state. The pre-2012 leadership tolerated the rot as a necessary price to pay for stability. It now seems that a new kind of leadership is in place. It has pledged to wage war on corruption. That war has a double agenda. One aim is to purge political opponents within the party states, always necessary for any Chinese leadership. A second aim is to crush the competing power of oligarchic clusters so as to concentrate not only political but also economic power in the hands of the party state's leadership. There are observers who think that the only serious aim is to purge political opponents, but that is probably too simple. More likely, what we are seeing is a leadership on the warpath both for control within the party states and for the party states' control in society. The Standard. The economist Amartya Sen has recently compared China favorably to India in governance and delivery. Not only is the hope that India might overtake China one day in economic growth a distant one, but also China has done far more than India to raise life expectancy, expand general education, and secure health care for its people. That may be a pertinent comparison to highlight India's underperformance, although India is now in fact overtaking China in economic growth, but does not have much to say for or about China. It is no doubt true that China in many ways has been outperforming India, but the ambition of China's leaders is not to outperform the underperformers. It is to be up there with the best. The provision of public services has without question improved in recent decades, but then those provisions have been totally destroyed during the Maoist disasters. China may be improving in securing health care and social security for its people, but Britain, for example, introduced the National Health Service in 1948, from the start miles ahead of contemporary Chinese health care coverage. When the country was run down by war, poorer than China is today, and still had rationing in the provision of food and other necessities. And Sweden and Norway introduced the people's pensions in the 1950s and 1960s, from the start miles ahead of contemporary Chinese security, when they were not much, if at all, ahead in economic capacity to where China is now. Indeed, the political secret of the excellence of wealth services, such as Scandinavia, to take the well-known example, or Costa Rica, to take a less well-known one, or for that matter, China's neighbor South Korea, is that social provisions are introduced early in the development process, really before the country, by narrow economic analysis, can afford them. The reason is that it is in the early stages of development, when the risk of poverty is widespread, that there is a potentially broad political coalition in favor of effective anti-poverty measures. If the country waits until economic growth has made social provision affordable, it will be too late. The majority will have moved out of the poverty risk zone, and anti-poverty policies will have been reduced to a minority concern. China's strategy is growth first, equality second. In that, the regime has made a strategic mistake. It is clear to see that the rising middle class is not making itself the driving force for policy of social solidarity. A mistake, that is, if the building of an effective welfare state has been a regime intention. The standard against which China should be measured is the one the Chinese leaders have themselves set. Their claim to excellence is not that they are doing better than they have previously, since China had pretty much collapsed after the Cultural Revolution. It is more absolute, not just better, but good. Nor is their claim that they are doing better than others. It is again more absolute. They are doing as well as anyone. China is a grown-up country that does not need to be patronized as developing. We should take the Chinese leaders' boast of excellence seriously. That, for example, is the standard set by the World Bank and the Development Research Center of the Chinese State Council in China 2030, building a modern, harmonious, and creative society. Here the comparison is with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD countries, more than with developing countries. The regime gives itself legitimacy by the claim to represent not just strength, but that should be feared, but also quality that should be admired. If that is the way they want to be seen, that is the way we should see them. A point of reference. It is my previous work with colleagues on the states in South Korea, the Republic of Korea, that has led me to China as the obvious next step. That reference has been helpful. It puts China in perspective. South Korea's modernization is the greatest development story ever told. China's development in some ways looks similar, rising from the ashes of destruction, strong leadership by an authoritarian state, a complex mesh of states and capitalism, rapid growth. But that comparison does not hold long. When the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2014 that the Chinese story is the greatest success story of our time, he was repeating a fantasy that has now been told so many times and in so many versions that it is becoming perceived truth. The Chinese story is one of bigness, but in greatness it is not much up against, for example, the story of South Korea, or for the matter of Taiwan. In South Korea, in 40 years, there were 3 monumental achievements. Poverty was turned to affluence, and to real affluence, making Korea a high-income country. Dictatorship was turned to democracy, and a safety net was spread under the country so that no significant section of the population was excluded from the benefits of economic advancement and with social protection that have helped to preserve Korea as a relatively egalitarian society, in contrast to China's runaway inequality. China's reform and opening up has now been unfolding for nearly 40 years, but has followed South Korea in only one achievement, in economic growth. And in the time South Korea made itself a high-income country, China has made itself no more than a middle-income one. Lin Yifu, the Chinese economist and former vice president of the World Bank, has observed that in recent times, only two economies, South Korea and Taiwan, have managed to leap from low-income to high-income status, implying that China is now on the road to becoming the third one. But this is a false comparison, and not only because he forgot some contending countries. China's modernization is narrowly economic. In South Korea and Taiwan, modernization has been comprehensive, economic, yes, but also political and social. So looking at China with the South Korean story in mind, I'm not as impressed as are some whose vantage may have been, for example, sluggish economies in Europe or the United States. Nor am I all that impressed with China's growth. It is not singular in its best times, pretty typical for East Asia. The economy got off to a good start after the revolution in 1949, but was then ground to a halt in a wasted generation. It picked up again as of the 1980s, but if we take the entire period of the People's Republic, it has been less than it should have been by the standard of the region. The particular putting of China in perspective has been of consequence. It opened my eyes early on to two observations that have stayed at the back of my mind while working my way through this project. First, China's achievements are big in quantity, but small in quality. The numbers may be impressive, but much of the substance is shabby. Second, even in quantitative terms, what bedazzles is not growth as such, although observers often say it is, but bigness. China weighs more in the world than, for example, South Korea, not because it has outperformed South Korea, which it has not, but because it is so big. The Korean states and social policy. In the Korean states and social policy, how South Korea lifted itself from poverty and dictatorship to affluence and democracy. My colleagues and I offered a political history of South Korea from 1945 to 2000 through the prism of social policy. This was a state-led economic development, and the state that led it was authoritarian and imperious, brutally dictatorial. It was a state that used social policy actively as an instrument of economic development. In the literature, it is described as a developmental state, with a developmental welfare state as one of its tools. It has been assumed that what enabled the South Korean state to lead as effectively as it did was that it had autocratic strength. This is also a widespread assumption for China. However, in our study, we found that although the developmental state has strength and used it, strength was still not its defining characteristic. What made this state effective was rather an unexpectedly sophisticated use of strength. The authoritarian leaders in Korea had power and were uncompromisingly hard when they saw that to be necessary. But it was not by subduing its population with strength that they pulled the country along in development. They did that by mobilizing their population into a grand project of modernization. Success came from the way the state worked with society. In looking from South Korea to China, the similarity is in rapid economic growth under the stewardship of an authoritarian state. But there is authoritarianism, and then there is dictatorship. The Korean states before redemocratization was for the most part only authoritarian. The Chinese state was and is a party state. Korea was less of a command system, and the leaders were dependent on ruling through coalitions and alliances. There was a corrupt mesh of state and business, but businesses were not state-owned and rather a part of the civil society that the rulers were dependent on mobilizing. Both regimes were challenged by uprising in their populations. In Korea in 1987 and in China in 1989, but reacted differently. In Korea, the authoritarian regime tried to survive through the crisis of popular revolt, but was unable to hold on to power and stepped aside to allow democratic reform. In China, the regime did not give in, but reached for its ultimate power resource, the military, and crushed the revolt with weaponry. In Korea, there being no party states, the leaders could not react similarly. They did not have a similar resource of ultimate power at their disposal, and did not have the justification for the use of force that is contained in the ideological and organizational structure of a party state. Presiding over a country that was not and did not have the justification for the use of force that is contained in the ideological organizational structure of a party state. Presiding over a country that was not monolithic but built on vibrant civil society institutions which had evolved during the period of modernization, including in business and voluntarism. The authoritarian leaders could relinquish control without fearing that their project of modernization would collapse. Indeed, had to give in, since an attempt to hold on to power with force would have destroyed the project. That was their raison d'etre and their only claim to legitimacy. In China, the leaders could not compromise because that would have meant the demise of the party state and because there was no civil society for China to fall back on. Wherefore, compromise would lead to chaos. Nor did they have to compromise because they had the physical and ideological means to hold on in their hands. The authoritarian states in South Korea, for the first military coup in 1961 to redemocratization in 1987, managed society in ways that are best described as consistently paradoxical. It worked in different ways at the same time, combining modes of governance that would usually elsewhere be seen to be incompatible and contradictory. In holding power, the autocrats and dictators were brutally hard. General and later President Park was the first and greatest of the autocratic leaders and the man who carved out this contradictory mode of governance. One of his early initiatives was the creation of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency as a secret police under his personal command. The trade union movement, in particular, suffered relentless oppression. But in using power in governance, in contrast, the Korean autocrats were shrewd, sophisticated, and in their own way surprisingly soft. President Park was as early in starting to build the Korean welfare state as he was in building a Korean secret police. While with one hand theirs was a state of dictatorship, with the other hand a state of collaboration, cooptation, and mobilization. It was not one or the other, not dictatorial and therefore non-collaborative, and not collaborative and therefore non-dictatorial, but both dictatorial and collaborative. This was a state that was ruthless in holding on to power until meeting its ultimate test, but that in governance worked more through coalitions than by brute commands. We identified 4 coalitions of mobilization. Our first coalition was between political leaders and their officials and advisors. Here, the autocrats used their hard hand to purge or sideline those who were not reliable. But once that was done, they showed their soft hand to the officials and advisors with whom they could work, brought them into their realm of power, gave them authority, and created institutions for them to work through. For example, powerful advisory bodies which worked more partnership with their political bosses than as simple lackeys. An ancient idea of impartiality in officialdom survived to some degree. The Korean economy was corrupt, but public service delivery was never plagued by the kind of endemic graft that is a characteristic of China. Civil servants and advisors were flattered into being able to think of themselves as apolitical, but were in reality strongly political. They were men, almost always men, although now, in a further sign of genuine modernization, the president is a woman, Park Geun-hye, General Park's daughter, of the world, who saw themselves as modernizers in the service of their nation, and who brought an ethos of modernization into the grand political project. They looked out to the rest of the world and saw, for example, that modern nations have welfare states. Therefore, they said, we too, if we are to be modern, must have welfare states. Our second coalition was between government and business, in particular big business. This coalition is well known, but here also we need to understand its paradoxical nature. The military coup in 1961 was in part directed against the culture of crony capitalism that had evolved in the first years after the birth of South Korea in 1948, during the reign of Syngman Rhee, the first president. But General Park, against his own instinct, soon recognized that he could not realize his ambition of industrial modernization in any other way than through the capitalists he despised, and therefore accepted a settlement of collaboration with them that must have been distasteful to him. To get them to do his bidding, he had to literally buy them. What resulted was not a pretty sight. It was a peculiar brand of state-led monopoly capitalism, steeped in pervasive two-way corruption. But it was effective. The resulting economic growth has been steady and continuous, and second to none the world had ever seen. A third coalition was with civil society and voluntary agencies. This coalition has been less recognized than the government business coalition, but was no less important. Monetary agencies were a U.S. import after 1945, much of it growing out of socially oriented missionary movements. They were at work from the start and continued to be active during the authoritarian period, providing much of what was delivered of social services. The autocratic rulers did not crush this movement, and nor did they nationalize it, but they Koreanized it and dismissed the Americans. Again, they took control and let civil society agencies know who was boss and what design was that they were obliged to work within. But once that was clear, they also gave these non-government actors space and authority. They let them survive in a deal, much as with business, in which the agencies took it upon themselves to deliver services the governors needed to get delivered, but did not have the means to deliver themselves, in return for the ability to engage in the formation of associations and networks. And the fourth collision was with the people themselves. South Korea was an unruly nation, and those who are old enough will remember, for example, the constant street battles between students and police. The unrest was important, not because until the end it threatened the regime, but because it contributed to never silencing the demand for democracy. But this unruliness was still on the surface. Underneath was a compliant and hard-working population. The government used various means to mobilize popular acquiescence. It extracted obedience by delivering economic growth. It bought itself legitimacy with the help of education and social security. It gave people reasons for compliance by forcing employers, at least in the big corporations, to provide occupational welfare to workers and their families, and to be at least marginally better employers than they were themselves inclined to be, and by directing voluntary agencies to deliver social services. And importantly, it mobilized people across the country through a cultural revolution under the name of the Samuel movement. First in the rural new community movement, and then the urban industrial new factory community movement. These were paternalistic movements that encouraged an ethos of responsibility and self-reliance. They were extractive movements that put rural communities and industrial laborers and their families to work in development projects, large and small, which were run voluntarily and without much of government funding. But they were also organizational movements that gave millions of Koreans the experience of being members and participants in associations, committees, councils, and the like. They were grassroots movements that fed into, as did the network of voluntary agencies, civil society vibrance. Most authoritarian leaders believed that they themselves can and should run their country. The South Korean ones happened on an understanding that they needed to work with non-state forces. They had defined a mission of modernization for the country, to which they bound themselves, and for the realization of which they needed to stimulate and co-opt the energies of officials, advisors, businesses, voluntary agencies, and rural and industrial workers and families. Usually, authoritarian regimes such as the Soviet and East European ones seek to eliminate non-state institutions. Exceptionally, under South Korean authoritarianism, non-state institutes were stimulated and put to work. This is what finally explains the unlikely South Korean economic, political, and social development, and the role of state leadership. in it. It was not the governments had authoritarian strength. It was not that the governments had authoritarian strength, but that governments with authoritarian strength governed by mobilizing rather than just controlling. Mobilization is a strategy with consequences. Those who mobilized prosper and are allowed influence. South Korea's modernization was economic, but not only economic. It had two strands to it. The economy grew in production. Society grew in institutions. When authoritarianism collapsed, the dynamics of development proved to be sustainable because the institutions of a reasonably pluralistic economic, social, and political order were there, alive and well, and democratic governments could take over where autocratic governments had left off without counter-revolution, collapse, or further serious drama. In my book, Nation of Devils, Democratic Leadership and the Problem of Obedience, I ascribed good government to political order, and I find the core of political order to be a settlement between the governors and their various others, from the civil servants to the population out there in the country. Settlement, again, comes from governors giving others what they need in order to make themselves compliant and cooperative, at least reasonably so, and others giving governors the acquiescence they need in order to lead and rule with some effectiveness. When this works, there is a virtuous circle of collaboration. Most dictatorships are not settled, wherefore dictatorial governments fall back on repression. In South Korea, the dictatorship happened to find a unique form of settlement through mobilization. It was in many ways ugly, but it worked and in the end turned for good. The good. The government was harsh and the people unruly, but beneath that, there was a basic and unlikely settlement of collaboration. This, then, briefly, is the reference at the back of my mind as I look to China, an earlier East Asian miracle. Another authoritarian state, the dialectics of command and mobilization. A state's ability to work with partners. The destiny of society, the landscape between states and citizens, political order after a fashion, a way of managing society, development of equality. Do we see a similar panorama in China? There are similarities, but again, they are superficial. The party-state dominates society, is dedicated to control, and is far from working with non-state actors in coalitions of mutual dependency. The civil service is an organization of the party, so much so that the very term civil service does not really apply and is rarely used. Civil society remains subdued. The business community and new middle class are pulled into a top-down symbiosis with the party-state's apparatus. What is known as NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are, for the most part, more like state agencies than voluntary organizations, often referred to as gongos, government-organized NGOs. Associational life and networking is kept under strict control. Governance is complex, but not paradoxical. It is based on strength, control, and command. It's without the elegant combination of being both dictatorial and collaborative that we saw in the Korean case, and is backwards in any governance by mobilization. The state remains dictatorial and has failed to find the secrets of political order and settlement. The regime has given itself the assurance that the party state has been kept strong and civil society weak, the insurance for fear that there would be nothing but chaos for China to fall back on if the party states were to crumble. Here again, China is different. Now also in social structure, the party state is all-embracing. There are autonomous countervailing forces. There are no autonomous countervailing forces, no civil service and no independent business no business community or civil society in any real meaning. The Chinese have many social freedoms of being able to live and behave as they want, but they have no freedom of social organization. What there are of non-state actors and institutions are tied into a grand corporatist pact in which the party states calls the shots and holds the controlling reins. This book has become a critical interpretation of the Chinese model. I would expect one criticism back to be that it is China obsessed with Western biases. But that is a criticism I reject in advance. My perspective has been regional. In some of China's near neighbors, we have seen the magnificence of modernization, that is social and political as well as economic, and qualitative as well as quantitative. We have seen that not only dramatic growth, but comprehensive modernization is possible. We have seen that economic growth and political democratization are compatible. China's development falls short in that comparison. It is economic and quantitative, but not much more. What we should reasonably expect for China is what has been seen in the region. Except for bigness, the Chinese story is not the greatest success story of our times, it is not even a particularly great East Asian story.